Welcome to my channel. Timeless narrative. The year 1857 marked a dramatic turning point in India's history, as armed revolts erupted across large parts of northern and central India. These uprisings nearly caused the collapse of British rule in these regions, though order was eventually restored in the spring of 1858 by the advancing imperial forces. What followed was an unprecedented amount of violence on both sides. The British had long established a monopoly on violence in India, but the revolt shattered this control as the subjects of British rule retaliated with counter-violence. The British responded with brutal counterinsurgency measures, public executions, rebels being blown from cannons, and the indiscriminate burning of villages. In turn, the rebels, driven by deep resentment, also engaged in acts of massacre, targeting white civilians, women and children included, without mercy. One of the most notorious incidents, the Kanpur massacre of June 27, 1857, epitomized this violent rupture of colonial power. It was an indigenous expression of violence, breaking the British monopoly of force. The revolt marked the end of the East India Company's rule in India. After the rebellion was quelled in 1858, the British Crown took direct control over the Indian Empire through an Act of Parliament. While the uprising was long seen as a mere mutiny by the sepoys of the Bengal Army, it was, in reality, a much broader rebellion, joined by rural communities across northern India. The causes of the revolt, therefore, were not confined to the grievances of the army, but were rooted in a larger process of social and economic change that disrupted peasant communities over the course of the company's rule. In the mid-18th century, the East India Company had respected the traditions and customs of local communities and maintained a predominantly high-caste identity within the army. The Bengal Army, composed mainly of Brahmins, Rajputs, and Bhumihars, had its caste restrictions carefully respected. However, this began to change in the 1820s when the British introduced military reforms aimed at creating a more universal military culture. These reforms slowly eroded the caste-based privileges and pecuniary benefits that had once been an important feature of the army. Resistance to these reforms grew in the 1840s, laying the groundwork for the 1857 revolt. The early signals of discontent became apparent in January 1857, when rumors spread among the sepoys stationed near Calcutta that the new Enfield rifle cartridges had been greased with cow and pig fat. The cartridges, which needed to be bitten off before loading, ignited fears that the British were conspiring to destroy the sepoys' religious and caste identities and forcibly convert them to Christianity. Although the British authorities swiftly ceased production of these cartridges and made concessions to allay the sepoys' fears, the damage had been done. The trust between the sepoys and the British could not be restored. The situation came to a head on March 29, 1857, when Mongol Pandey, a sepoy in Barrackpur near Calcutta, attacked a European officer. His comrades, refusing to arrest him, were court-martialed and executed. This act of defiance sparked further unrest among the sepoys. By May 10, 1857, the revolt spread from Meerut to Delhi, where the sepoys declared the aging Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar as the Emperor of Hindustan. From Delhi, the uprising spread to other army centers in the northwestern provinces and Awadh, turning into a widespread civil rebellion as rural communities, disgruntled by British policies, joined the revolt. By June 19, Lord Canning, the Governor-General, despaired in a letter that much of northern India, from Rohilkhand to the Doab, was in open rebellion and lawlessness. Despite the magnitude of the rebellion, it was primarily confined to the Bengal Army. The Madras and Bombay regiments remained largely loyal to the British, as did the Punjabi and Gurkha soldiers, who actively helped suppress the revolt. The Bengal Army's composition, dominated by high-caste sepoys with minimal British military presence, was one of the key factors in the scale of the rebellion. These sepoys had long nursed grievances regarding their service conditions, a decline in their pay, discrimination in promotions and pensions, and new service rules that disregarded their caste restrictions, particularly in relation to overseas service. The soldiers' refusal to serve in places like Burma, Sindh, or Afghanistan led to reprisals and dismissals. Another significant factor was the fear among sepoys that the British were determined to convert them to Christianity, exacerbated by the presence of missionaries, rumors about the contamination of food, and the controversy surrounding the Enfield rifle cartridges. The annexation of Awadh in 1856, a major hub of recruitment for the Bengal army, further fueled the resentment. Awadh's annexation symbolized British betrayal, shattering the sepoys' faith in the British and marking a breaking point for their loyalty. Many sepoys, who had close familial and community ties to Awadh, were devastated by the loss of their homeland. But the revolt was not merely a mutiny of the army, it also witnessed widespread civilian participation, especially among the landed aristocracy and peasants. The feudal lords, or talukdars, were particularly aggrieved by the British annexations under Lord Dalhousie's doctrine of lapse, which resulted in the annexation of several princely states, including Satara, Nagpur, and Jhansi. In 1856, the annexation of Awadh added to the resentment as the royal family was deposed, and the aristocracy lost their power. These displaced feudal lords, such as Nana Sahib, Begum Hazrat Mahal, Khan Bahadur Khan, and Rani Lakshmi Bai, became key leaders of the revolt in their respective regions. In addition to the feudal elements, the peasants were also deeply involved in the rebellion, driven by the oppressive revenue policies and the annexation of their lands. The annexation of Awadh, which resulted in the disempowerment of the talukdars, coupled with high taxation and unfair land settlements, forced the peasantry into debt and dispossession. As a result, peasants and landlords alike joined forces against the British, with the former rallying behind their displaced lords in the hope of regaining their lost privileges. Similarly, in the northwestern provinces, where many talukdars had also lost their estates, the rebellion gained considerable support from the rural population, who shared a common enemy in the British. The story of the Indian Rebellion of 1857, as Eric Stokes, 1980, suggests, is far from straightforward. The complexities of the situation reveal a more nuanced narrative than a simple, unified revolt. First, it's important to note that not all talukdars, landed elites, suffered under the British revenue system. In many regions, the proprietary rights of the land circulated among the traditional landed castes, and new magnates often emerged from previously declining castes. These new magnates, as Stokes terms them, were able to adapt to the shifting social and political landscape of Awadh and the northwestern provinces. Rather than rising up against British authority, these successful talukdars exerted a stabilizing influence over their communities. Similarly, not all peasants were equally affected by the burdens of British rule. Those living in fertile, irrigated areas were better positioned to withstand the overassessment of land revenue, while those in more backward regions faced greater hardships. However, it was often not absolute deprivation, but rather relative deprivation, seeing their fellow caste members prospering in neighboring areas, that fueled resentment. In these backward regions, peasants were also more vulnerable to the encroachments of moneylenders, or mahajans, and the resulting loss of land. Yet, it is uncertain whether indebtedness directly contributed to the outbreak of the revolt. In fact, Stokes argues that there was an inverse relationship between indebtedness and revolt, as dry lands with high revenue assessments were less attractive to outside moneylenders. Instead, these moneylenders were more likely to seize land where cash cropping was expanding. In such cases, the objective seemed to be less about physical dispossession of land and more about political control of the peasant producers. As a result, the backward regions with high revenue demands, where mahajans had less influence, were often the most prone to rebellion. The peasants' resistance was also shaped by the presence of strong caste or community ties, such as those among the Gujars, Rajputs, or Sayyids. These groups were better able to withstand pressure from external forces, including moneylenders, and to organize resistance. Social cohesion and collective power were crucial factors in fostering rebellion. And in one common thread that ran through all levels of rural society, there was a pervasive suspicion of British rule, which was often seen as a threat to their religion. This fear was further fueled by earlier social reforms and the direct influence of Christian missionaries, who were seen as symbols of foreign intrusion. Both Hindus and Muslims felt similarly threatened, and thus, Hindu-Muslim unity was maintained throughout the revolt. As C.A. Bailey notes, the 1857 rebellion was not a single, unified movement, but rather a convergence of many localized uprisings. The nature of the revolt itself has been widely debated since its inception. Some contemporaries, particularly the British, saw it as a mutiny of sepoys, with civilian unrest being a secondary phenomenon. This interpretation was echoed by later Indian historians such as S.N. Sen and R.C. Majumdar, who portrayed it as a military mutiny that spiraled into a breakdown of law and order. On the other hand, figures like Benjamin Disraeli and Karl Marx recognized that the revolt was not simply a military mutiny but a broader national uprising. In the 20th century, figures like V.D. Savarkar would go even further, framing the revolt as an Indian War of Independence, a view that would gain academic support later on. However, historians now generally agree that the revolt of 1857 was not a nationalist movement in the modern sense. As Thomas Metcalfe wrote in 1965, the revolt was something more than a sepoy mutiny, but something less than a national revolt. The rebellion was fragmented, with no clear, unified political agenda. Instead, the rebels were united by a shared disdain for British authority and a common belief that their caste, religion, and way of life were under threat. Many rebels fought not for a political alternative but for the restoration of a moral order that had been disrupted by foreign rule. The leaders of the revolt were often at odds with one another, and their lack of coordination made the rebellion more susceptible to failure. As Metcalfe suggests, if the rebels had succeeded, they would have likely turned on each other. Despite this, the rebellion was not purely an elitist movement, as some historians argue. While feudal lords and talukdars played a role in the uprising, they were often reluctant leaders, pushed into action by the masses. In fact, in many instances, peasants, artisans, and sepoys took the initiative in the revolt, forcing their leaders to join the struggle. The rebellion, thus, was a grassroots movement led by peasants and sepoys, not simply an elite-led revolt. The British ultimately suppressed the rebellion through a combination of military force and strategic political maneuvers. As the British forces gathered reinforcements, the rebels were slowly pushed back, and by early 1859, the revolt was largely crushed. The British victory was not solely due to their superior military tactics. The rebels, many of whom were poorly equipped and lacked resources, were at a disadvantage. The British had the full backing of a centralized administration and military infrastructure, which allowed them to contain the rebellion's spread. Stokes observes that the rebels' centripetal impulse to congregate at Delhi, rather than dispersing, prevented them from achieving broader coordination. This contributed to the eventual defeat of the rebellion. Despite the British victory, the events of 1857 led to significant changes in the nature of British rule in India. The rebellion marked the end of the East India Company's rule, and in August 1858, the British Parliament passed the Act for the Better Government of India, transferring authority to the British Crown. Queen Victoria's proclamation promised religious toleration and recognition of Indian traditions, marking a shift from the earlier reformist zeal of the company. This shift towards a more autocratic and conservative form of rule further distanced the British from the Indian population, creating a sense of racial segregation that would persist for years to come. In the aftermath of the rebellion, the British government became increasingly wary of Indian aspirations for political power. The growing discontent among educated Indians, frustrated by the limited opportunities under British rule, eventually gave rise to the nationalist movements that would dominate the 20th century. Thus, the Revolt of 1857, while not a nationalist uprising in the modern sense, was a crucial moment in India's journey toward independence. It laid the groundwork for future struggles for freedom, even if it did not result in immediate political change.